When people think about the fall of Rome, they imagine barbarians storming the gates, legions collapsing, or emperors poisoned in marble palaces. But empires don't crumble just from outside attack. They rot from within. And one of the most corrosive forces is always money. Rome didn't just fall because of invasions or corruption. It fell because its currency collapsed. And the lessons from that collapse still apply to every modern economy that thinks it can play games with money and get away with it. Let's set the stage. For centuries, Rome's economic backbone was the silver denarius. First minted around 201 before Christ, it was nearly pure silver trusted across the empire and beyond. Roman soldiers were paid in it. Merchants demanded it, and ordinary people stored their wealth in it. The denarius wasn't just money. It was confidence in metal form. The empire's power and the coin's value were linked. As long as people believed in Rome, they believed in its money. But running an empire is expensive. Legions had to be paid, roads and aqueducts built, and wars financed. By the 2nd century after Christ, Rome was stretched thin, defending borders against Germanic tribes, Parthians in the east, and unrest within. Tax revenues could not keep pace with military costs, and so emperors turned to an age-old trick, debased. Instead of taxing citizens, more a sure way to spark rebellion, they reduced the silver content in the denarius. The numbers tell the story. Under Emperor Augustus, who ruled at the dawn of the empire, the denarius contained about 95% silver. It was strong, stable, and universally trusted. But as decades passed and emperors faced the ever-growing bills of empire, they quietly shaved that number down. By the reign of Caracalla, in the early 3rd century, the silver content had fallen to around 50%, and by the time of Emperor Gallienus in the mid-3rd century, it contained less than 5% silver. A coin once made of solid metal had become a disc of bronze coated with a thin silver wash. The people could see and feel the difference. Coins that once had a satisfying weight and shine now looked dull, cheap, and suspicious. Merchants noticed first. Soldiers followed, and soon, everyone understood what was happening, even if they didn't know the economics behind it. Rome's money was being hollowed out from within. Inflation followed, as it always does. Prices rose because money was no longer anchored to real value. A measure of wheat that once cost a single denarius might suddenly cost 10, then 20. Wages couldn't keep up. Savings lost. Meaning, what had once been a thriving monetary system became a slow-motion disaster. This was not abstract theory. It destroyed the lives of ordinary Romans. Soldiers demanded higher pay to cover rising costs, putting more strain on imperial finances. Merchants stopped accepting the debased coins, preferring barter or payments in gold. Local economies reverted to direct trade because the currency was no longer trusted, and the more confidence eroded, the more emperors struck cheaper coins, hoping that volume could replace value. But it never can. It was a vicious cycle, same cycle that has repeated in countless inflations since. Imagine living in that world. You wake up one morning, go to the market, and find that yesterday's loaf of bread now costs twice as much. You go to sell your goods, but the buyer won't take your coins. He wants payment in grain, in silver, or in anything real. You start to wonder whether the coins in your purse mean anything at all. Once trust disappears, money ceases to function. And when money stops working, everything else begins to crumble. By the middle of the 3rd century, the cracks in Rome's economy were becoming chasms. The crises of the 3rd century, a 50-year storm of invasions, civil wars, and economic collapse, was more than just a political drama. It was a financial catastrophe. Between 235 and 284 after Christ, Rome cycled through more than 24 emperors, most meeting violent ends. The empire was fracturing, but beneath the blood and chaos lay a deeper truth. The financial system that had supported Rome for centuries was broken beyond repair. Taxes were still demanded, but the coins used to pay them were worth less each year. Farmers abandoned their lands rather than pay in worthless money. Trade routes that had once stretched from Britain to Egypt began to falter. Towns shrank. Urban populations fled to the countryside, seeking survival rather than prosperity. The very infrastructure that had made Rome great, the roads, ports, Markets was decaying because the economic engine that sustained it had seized up. The emperors, desperate to hold the empire together, turned to increasingly desperate measures. They imposed price controls, fixed wages, and even forced professions to become hereditary to ensure a steady supply of labor. If your father was a baker, you would be a baker. If he was a soldier, so would you. Freedom eroded along with the currency. Once the economy collapsed, compulsion replaced confidence. The empire that had once prided itself on law and order became an economy of decrees and punishments. One emperor in particular, Diocletian, tried to stop the bleeding. In 301 after Christ, he issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, a sweeping attempt to control inflation by setting fixed prices for over 1,000 goods and services, from grain and meat to clothing and labor wages. Violators faced death. The message was clear. The emperor could command prices by law, just as he commanded legions by decree. But markets do not obey laws when trust in money is gone. The edict failed spectacularly. Prices could not be frozen by fiat when the money itself was melting away. A black market exploded almost overnight. Merchants hid their goods rather than sell at fixed prices that guaranteed loss. Farmers stopped bringing grain to the cities. Trade dwindled to a whisper. Official commerce collapsed. And with it, tax revenues fell even further. Diocletian's grand effort to restore order only accelerated the decline. The people learned quickly that no emperor's command could make a broken coin whole again. Eventually, the denarius became so degraded that it was abandoned altogether. The silver coin that had once symbolized Rome's greatness was now a relic of its decay. In its place, a new currency emerged under Constantine the Great, the solidus, a gold coin of consistent purity introduced around 312 after Christ. The solidus brought back a measure of stability, at least in the Eastern Roman Empire, which would later be known as Byzantium. It remained remarkably stable for centuries, but by the time it appeared, the damage to the Western Empire was already irreversible. The denarius had been more than just money. It had been the glue that held Rome's vast economy together. Its collapse hollowed out the empire's core, leaving a shell that could no longer sustain its armies, fund its infrastructure, or maintain its authority. The legions that once guarded the frontiers could no longer be paid reliably. Trade networks that once spanned continents dissolved. Confidence evaporated. The empire's political power withered in step with its monetary decay. The fall of Rome was not a single event, but a long unraveling, a gradual erosion of trust, wealth, and order. The barbarians at the gates may have delivered the final blow, but the empire had already been fatally weakened from within. Currency collapse was one of the sharpest threads in that unraveling. And though the Roman story feels ancient, the pattern it reveals is timeless. Whenever money is corrupted, society follows. When the state trades honesty for convenience, the reckoning always comes. Rome's leaders thought they could cheat reality. They believed that by stamping the emperor's face on a coin, they could give it value, no matter what it contained. But trust cannot be minted. Value cannot be decreed. When money stops being real, empires begin to die not with a shout, but with a whisper of worth fading into nothing. By the time Constantine introduced the solidus, the Roman economy was already a ghost of its former self. The empire that had once built aqueducts, paved roads across continents, and traded with distant kingdoms had been reduced to patchwork provinces clinging to survival. The solidus was pure and stable. Yes, but it came too late to save what had been lost. The foundation of trust that money requires had already been shattered, and once that trust is gone, rebuilding it is like trying to make water flow uphill. The story of Rome's currency collapse is not just about economics. It's about confidence, the invisible glue that binds societies together. Every coin, every note, every transaction depends on a shared belief that what we exchange today will still hold value tomorrow. When that belief dies, people stop cooperating. They hoard, they barter, they hide. Commerce grinds to a halt, and fear replaces faith. In the late empire, that fear was everywhere. Soldiers, once the most loyal servants of Rome, began to lose faith in their paymasters. They were paid in coins that barely glimmered anymore, their silver coating rubbed away after a few days' use. To make up for the loss in value, they demanded higher wages. But the empire had no real silver left to give. So more coins were minted, more promises were made, and more trust evaporated. The legions that had once been Rome's pride became mercenaries in all but name, loyal to whoever could offer real payment, often in gold or goods instead of imperial currency. Merchants suffered too. In marketplaces from Gaul to Egypt, trade became chaotic. Prices changed daily, sometimes hourly. To protect themselves, traders raised prices even further, accelerating the inflation spiral. Many refused coins altogether, turning instead to barter. A farmer might trade wheat directly for cloth. A blacksmith might accept wine or livestock instead of coins. The complex economy that had once powered the empire was reverting to primitive exchange. It was as if civilization itself was running backward. For ordinary people, life became a struggle for survival. Savings accumulated over a lifetime could vanish in a few months of price increases. The middle class, the backbone of any stable society, was wiped out. Wealth flowed upward to those who held tangible assets. Landowners, tax collectors, and officials with access to gold or foreign trade. Everyone else watched their livelihoods disintegrate. A loaf of bread, a jar of oil, a roof over one's head, all became luxuries. Poverty spread like a shadow across the provinces. Rome tried everything to contain the disaster. Taxation became more aggressive. Imperial agents scoured villages to extract what little remained, often demanding payment in kind, grain, livestock, or labor instead of worthless coins. Those who couldn't pay were punished harshly. Farmers abandoned their fields and fled, preferring to risk exile or death rather than hand over their last reserves. The countryside emptied. Cities starved. The empire's once thriving agricultural system was breaking apart. This was the dark irony. The more Rome tried to enforce stability, the more instability it created. Every new decree, every tax increase, every desperate attempt to control the economy only deepened the crisis. When people no longer trust money, the state itself loses legitimacy. And when that happens, no amount of laws or soldiers can hold society together. By the late 3rd century, the Roman world was divided in spirit and substance. The Eastern Empire, centered on cities like Constantinople and Antioch, had access to richer trade routes and gold reserves. It managed to hold on, barely. The Western Empire, stretched from Italy to Britain, was sinking fast. Its armies were underpaid, its people overtaxed, and its rulers increasingly powerless. Provinces began to act independently, minting their own coins, raising their own militia. The idea of Rome, one empire, one people, one currency, was dissolving into fragments. The solidist stabilized part of the economy for a time, but it could not resurrect the old prosperity. By then, money had become a tool of survival rather than progress. People no longer saw coins as symbols of shared wealth or imperial pride. They were tokens, useful only as long as someone else accepted them. And when money loses its moral weight, when it ceases to represent effort, trust, and honesty, society becomes transactional in the darkest sense. Loyalty, justice, even life itself can be bought or sold. The consequences were visible everywhere. Public works, once a hallmark of Roman greatness, fell into decay. Aqueducts dried up, roads crumbled, and grand temples became empty shells. The state no longer had the resources or the credibility to maintain them. Corruption flourished as officials demanded bribes in gold or goods to overlook taxes or grant favors. Inflation didn't just destroy wealth. It destroyed morality. When the currency became fake, so did everything built on it. And yet, through all this, the emperors continued to believe they could manage the crisis from the top. They issued new coins, new edicts, new slogans, promising stability. But their authority meant little when their money was worthless. Even Diocletian, one of Rome's most capable administrators, could not command the markets. His price edict had been meant to restore fairness. Instead, it turned markets into black zones of fear and deceit. Merchants were executed for selling goods at market rates. Farmers stopped growing surplus crops, and cities faced shortages of basic necessities. The state's heavy hand had crushed the fragile trust that remained. By the 4th century, Rome's economy was barely recognizable. The empire increasingly relied on tribute from conquered peoples and the plunder of its own territories to sustain itself. Gold from the solidus system flowed eastward, enriching Constantinople but draining the western provinces. As the west weakened, barbarian mercenaries, Goths, Vandals, Franks were hired to fill the ranks of the army. They were paid not in coins, but in land and loot. The empire was eating itself, trading territory for time. Eventually, even the appearance of control vanished. The Western Roman Empire, once the heart of civilization, became a landscape of fragmented powers, warlords, governors, and generals, each carving out their own piece of the corpse. The currency collapse had done what no invading army could accomplish alone. It had broken the economic and moral spine of Rome. But Rome's story didn't end in silence. Its lessons echoed forward, reverberating through centuries of human history, because the collapse of the denarius wasn't just a Roman tragedy, it was a blueprint. Every empire that has since risen to greatness has faced the same temptation, the belief that wealth can be created by decree, that money can be manipulated without consequence, that trust can be stretched indefinitely without breaking. Rome proved that it cannot. When the silver was drained from the denarius, so too was the integrity drained from the empire. That is the eternal warning. A civilization may boast grand architecture, powerful armies, and glorious traditions, but if its money becomes a lie, those achievements crumble like dust. And though the fall of Rome unfolded over centuries, its essence can be summarized in one truth: no society can survive when its currency loses credibility. The denarius had started as a symbol of strength. It ended as a symbol of decay. And the story of that decay would not stay buried in the ruins of Rome. Centuries later, as other nations rose and fell, the same patterns would reappear: new coins, new paper, new promises, but always the same result when the lessons of Rome were forgotten. The Roman experiment with debasement was the world's first great monetary cautionary tale, but it was not the last. The centuries that followed would see the same script played out again and again: governments spending beyond their means, printing or minting to cover deficits, destroying the value of their money, and watching their societies unravel in the process. Rome had shown the world what happens when an empire mistakes illusion for value. The tragedy was that no one learned soon enough to stop repeating it. As the Western Empire withered, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines, held on, buoyed by the solidus and its disciplined monetary system. Their gold coin would endure for nearly 700 years. Yet even there, the pattern eventually re-emerged. Debasement returned, inflation followed, and once again, trust crumbled. The names and faces changed, but the underlying truth did not. Every civilization thinks it's different. Every government believes it can outsmart history. Rome thought so too. But history doesn't forgive arrogance, especially the arrogance of those who think they can counterfeit reality. The empire's coins still survive in museums, too decimal, faded, almost weightless. Pick one up, and you can almost feel the warning in your hand. What was once real became an illusion, and the illusion devoured an empire. The Roman collapse didn't just mark the end of an empire. It set the tone for every currency crisis that followed. Long after the legions had vanished and the marble cities had turned to ruins, the pattern remained etched into human history. The faces on the coins would change, the printing presses would replace the mints, but the underlying mistake would stay the same: believing that money is power, instead of understanding that money is trust. Centuries after Rome fell, the same illusions returned again and again. Medieval kingdoms clipped their coins, melted them down, and reminted them with less precious metal, pretending value could be stretched like gold leaf. Each time, the result was predictable. Trade slowed, merchants fled, and faith in rulers faded. Money, the blood of civilization, was being poisoned. But it was not until the modern era that humanity rediscovered Rome's folly on a grand scale. Fast forward to the 20th century. Europe was still reeling from the destruction of World War I. Nations were bankrupt, cities in ruins, millions dead. In Germany, the once mighty industrial heart of Europe, the government faced impossible debts, especially the crushing reparations demanded by the Treaty of Versailles. The sum was astronomical, far beyond what the nation could produce or pay. So, like the Roman emperors before them, German leaders reached for the easiest tool in their grasp, the printing press. At first, the move seemed harmless. Printing more marks helped the government meet short-term obligations, paying soldiers, funding reconstruction, and supporting the unemployed. But every new bill diluted the value of the ones already in circulation. Slowly, then rapidly, prices began to climb. By 1921, inflation was noticeable. By 1922, it was alarming, and by 1923, it had spiraled into one of the most catastrophic hyperinflations in history. A loaf of bread that had cost 1 mark before the war now cost hundreds, then thousands, 10 millions. Eventually, it cost 200 billion marks. People carried their wages home in wheelbarrows, their pay worthless by nightfall. Workers demanded to be paid twice a day just to buy food before prices doubled again. Pensioners who had saved for decades found their life savings could no longer buy a single meal. Children played with stacks of banknotes because they were worth less than paper toys. The currency that once anchored Europe's strongest economy had become meaningless. Justas in Rome, the result wasn't just economic, it was psychological. The German people lost faith, not only in their money, but in their leaders, their institutions, and even their future. Inflation had erased not just wealth, but trust. And from that chaos rose something far more dangerous than economic ruin: desperation. People who lose everything they've built don't just want stability, they demand Italiano. They will follow anyone who promises it, no matter the cost. And in that vacuum of hope, extremism flourished. Out of the ashes of the Mark came Adolf Hitler, whose rise to power was paved by economic despair. Rome had collapsed under the weight of debased silver. Germany collapsed under the weight of debased paper. But the story didn't end there. The same playbook reappeared in Zimbabwe nearly a century later. In the early 2000s, the government seized land from commercial farmers, triggering economic collapse and food shortages. Production plummeted, revenues vanished, and debts piled up. Rather than face the pain of fiscal reality, the government began printing money first cautiously, then recklessly. By 2008, Zimbabwe's inflation reached an almost unimaginable rate, 89.766 billion% per year. Prices doubled every 24 hours. Banknotes with absurd denominations 10 million, 100 million, even 100 trillion Zimbabwean dollars circulated like confetti. People starved while carrying backpacks full of cash. Eventually, the country abandoned its own currency entirely, turning to the US dollar and South African rand just to survive. The printing presses that had once promised prosperity had destroyed the very fabric of society. Shops closed, hospitals failed, schools ran out of supplies. Just as in ancient Rome, the illusion of easy money had become the instrument of ruin. You might think that such extremes could never happen in the developed world, that modern finance, central banks, and global markets have made us smarter than the emperors and dictators of old. But the same principles still apply. Money is still trust, and when that trust is abused, collapse follows slowly. Then suddenly, in the United States, the story took a different shape. Instead of clipping coins or printing trillion-dollar notes, the shift came quietly, behind the polished doors of power. For most of American history, the dollar was tied to gold, a promise that every bill could be exchanged for something real. That link acted as a restraint, preventing politicians from creating money out of thin air. But in 1971, President Richard Nixon severed that last tie, ending the gold standard and transforming the dollar into a purely fiat currency backed not by metal, but by government decree and public confidence. At first, nothing seemed to change. People still used the same dollars. The bills looked identical. Prices rose slowly, almost For the first time in American history, money was no longer a claim on tangible value, it was a claim on trust alone. And a syndrome that opened the door to temptation. Over the following decades, government spending soared. Deficits became a routine. Wars, welfare programs, and bailouts were funded not by higher taxes, but by creating more money and expanding credit. The national debt ballooned into the trillions. And while the economy grew, so did inflation. A dollar in 1971 could buy what takes more than $6 today. The coins look the same, the bills feel the same, but their purchasing power has eroded year after year. It's the same illusion Rome lived through. Same trick wrapped in modern packaging. The Federal Reserve, America's central bank, became the new mint of debasement not by reducing silver content, but by manipulating interest rates and expanding the money supply through policies like quantitative easing. Each new round of stimulus promised relief, just as each new Roman coin promised stability. But every promise came at a cost. The more dollars were created, the less each one was worth. Meanwhile, the effects rippled through society in familiar ways. The wealthy, who owned real assets, stocks, land, businesses saw their fortunes grow. The poor and middle class, who depended on wages and savings, fell behind. Prices for housing, education, and healthcare soared faster than incomes. The gap widened, resentment grew, and social cohesion weakened. Inflation, even when mild, is a thief that steals quietly, redistributing wealth from those who earn it to those who control the flow of money. This is the modern echo of Rome's denarius, where the emperors debased silver, we debased digital. The mechanism is different, but the result is the same. An illusion of prosperity built on the erosion of value. Governments point to rising GDP, booming stock markets, and record low interest rates as proof of success. But beneath those numbers lies the same fragile truth. Rome once faced growth, built on borrowed confidence, cannot last. And because the world is now interconnected, the stakes are higher than ever. Rome's collapse was imperium, Weimar's hyperinflation was national, Zimbabwe's was local, but today's economy is global. Every major currency, the dollar, the euro, the yen, the yuanes, fiat, untethered to any physical anchor. Central banks coordinate policy, print trillions in response to crises, and call it stimulus. Yet every stimulus is just another version of debased. The empire, this time, is not Rome, it's the entire modern financial system. The lesson from history is painfully clear. You can't cheat reality. You can manipulate numbers, you can redefine inflation, you can invent financial instruments that disguise debt, but you can't print trust. The Romans learned that when their coins turned to bronze, the Germans learned it when their marks turned to paper. The Zimbabweans learned it when their money turned to dust. And if the modern world refuses to learn it, the consequences will be global and irreversible. Because every time a society believes it can create wealth by printing symbols of it, it forgets what money truly is. A measure of value, not a substitute for it. Rome's mistake wasn't in losing silver, it was in losing honesty. And that same loss echoes through every inflationary age that followed. Each generation thinks it's discovered a smarter way to manage money. But history keeps whispering the same warning. You can't counterfeit confidence. The world today runs on paper promises and digital ledgers. The coins of silver and gold that once clinked in Roman hands are long gone, replaced by pixels on screens and numbers in bank accounts. Money has become invisible, abstract, a system of belief even more fragile than the coins that once bore the image of emperors. And yet, the rules have not changed. Every economy, every government, every empire still lives or dies by the same law. When trust in money collapses, everything built upon it falls too. The Roman denarius, the German mark, the Zimbabwean dolarich, tells the same story in a different language. The details shift, but the essence remains. The downfall always begins quietly, with rationalizations. Leaders tell themselves that printing a little more won't hurt, that deficits are temporary, that inflation can be managed. Economists invent new theories to justify what older generations would have called folly. The press praises stimulus, a salvation. Citizens adjust, prices rise, and the illusion of prosperity deepens. But illusions, no matter how convincing, cannot defy gravity forever. Look at the modern global system. Every major nation is now drowning in debt, far beyond what it could ever repay through honest taxation or production. Governments borrow to pay interest on previous borrowing. Central banks print money to buy that debt, creating a feedback loop of dependency. Each new crisis, whether a war, a pandemic, or a recession, becomes another excuse to conjure trillions out of thin air. And because this money enters the system through the financial elite, the benefits concentrate at the top, while costs diffuse to everyone else through higher prices and lower purchasing power. It is the oldest scam in civilization, dressed in modern clothing. Inflation today doesn't always arrive as hyperinflation. It doesn't have to. It can erode quietly, year by year, like rust eating through steel. A worker's salary rises, but so do housing costs, food prices, and taxes. Savings accounts yield almost nothing, while the cost of living keeps climbing. People sense something is wrong, but they can't quite name it. They work harder, yet fall further behind. This slow-motion decline is more insidious than any open collapse. It doesn't spark riots in the streets, but it hollows out the middle class just as surely as Rome's debasement hollowed out the Meanwhile, governments and central banks call this economic management. They measure inflation by selective statistics, omitting what rises fast. They redefine prosperity by counting debt-fueled spending as growth. They manipulate interest rates so low that saving becomes punishment and speculation becomes policy. The result is a world addicted to cheap money, a civilization built not on production, but on consumption and credit. And like every addict, it cannot stop without pain.